introduce myself. My name is Moacir Sá Pereira. I just defended my dissertation in American realist novels of the 1930s at the University of Chicago. I don't know Humboldt Park, but Humboldt Park is a very Puerto Rican neighborhood. I lived in its Mexican companion neighborhood for many, many years. Currently I live in Vilnius and I teach introductory Lithuanian to Erasmus students there. So that's a bit peculiar. A lot of my ideas in my dissertation grew out of my interest in maps. I took the year-long introductory sequence that my university offers in GIS, and I ran into a bunch of issues that I had a lot of trouble resolving. And as a result, and I'll mention these issues today, and as a result of those issues, my dissertation veered greatly away from the GIS I had hoped that it would espouse and feature and so on. But I did manage to stuff a bunch of geographical insight, I think, into one chapter, which was about Ernest Hemingway's From the Bell Tolls. Anyway, I'd like to thank you all for being here, and I'm pretty excited to present before people who are not just literary scholars, but actual geographers also. What you see will be very dilettantish, so I'm very excited to hear critiques and so on. So here's a very quick map of the presentation. First, there's the initial-ish reading of the novel that spurs on geographical questions. So you read the novel, and then you think, oh, this is kind of weird. Then there's an epistemological quandary that slows down answering these geographical questions. Then there's the resolution, which is creating a GIS, which helps solve, hopefully, that epistemological quandary, and also present new questions that require further textual reading and further analysis. So the first thing is the question-forming reading. Very quickly, From the Bell Tolls, if you don't know, takes place over 3 days in May 1937 in Spain during the Spanish Civil War. Almost all of the action happens in between Madrid and Segovia, in the woods and mountains that are there. So even though it has such a small plot-based geographical footprint, there are still at least 519 specific geographical mentions of at least 150 unique geocodable locations. I say at least because I did this by hand, so I may have missed some places. But when I count the numbers of times certain cities are mentioned, the list is a little bit peculiar. The top 10 cities in From the Bell Tolls. At the top are Madrid and Segovia, which makes perfect sense, but number 9 is Missoula. Missoula is the home of the University of Montana. And why on earth is Missoula such a frequent place that gets mentioned in the text? From the plot, you know that the protagonist, Robert Jordan, is an instructor of Spanish at the University of Montana, and he mentions Missoula as well as the university a couple of times. But it shows that Spain isn't the only thing that's on these people's minds. So I decided I would split the novel into 3 heteroglottic sites. And by heteroglottic, I have in mind Bakhtin's idea of heteroglossia, which is a diversity of speech types that interact and overlap within the novel. These speech types, the way they climb on top of each other, are one of, for him, the primary generic features of the novel. And by site, I have in mind the self-organizing and differentiating event space as described by the flat ontologists Sally Marston, Keith Woodward, and John Paul Jones III. Sites contain their own logics, their own spatial temporalities, their own organizations, their own blockages, and their own orders, but they also have emergent potentialities to create new relationships. So I decided I'd split the novel up into 3 of these. And they're rather clearly delineated. There's a narrative, heteroglottic site, which has 26 total geographical mentions. Then there's the discursive space, which is where Robert Jordan spends most of his time actually waiting to blow up a bridge. And during that time, he talks with his fellow partisans. And that has 230 total mentions, but he actually spends a lot of time doing that and spends, in terms of geographical sensibility, as much time just talking to himself. So his own interior monologues account for 231 of the 500-odd specific geographical mentions that there are. So then I geocode everything and run some geostatistical analyses. But wait a minute. Geocode sounds like I'm talking about the real world and not the fictional one. And geostatistical sounds kind of Cartesian and a little bit quantitative. And that's not exactly what I'm supposed to be doing, isn't that right? After all, there's hardly anybody who's more into quantitative literary analysis and himself has made dozens of maps of fictional worlds, which is, say, Franco Moretti. Even himself says that literary geography there's the literature in space and the space in literature. And though they may occasionally and interestingly overlap, they are essentially different, and Moretti will treat them as such. So what am I doing when I geocode stuff that happens in a novel? That's not the real world. And the quantitative concern gets a sort of exponent in Michel de Certeau, who splits the world into makers, or splits world makers into voyeurs and walkers. So you have the voyeur, who has the God's eye view, standing on top of the World Trade Center and sees can read the world, but the world is being created by the frog's eye view, by the people walking and writing the city, who never actually get to read it. So I need a box for this epistemological quandary. So this is a Steve Jobsian 2x2 box. So we have, sorry that the text is a little bit small. So you have space and literature are on one side, and you have walkers and voyeurs. This is a gross simplification, but I'm getting somewhere with this. So walkers in space is something kind of how I imagine critical geography. Voyeurs in space is how I imagine GIS. Look from above, you do mapping. Walkers in literature are sort of the Bachelard and influenced spatial turn in the humanities, the sort of poetics of space and things like that. And then that leaves voyeurs in literature, which is basically me with this. So this was why I was in a problem. It felt like I was doing something weird and wrong. So let me skip ahead a little bit here. But as I said, this is an absolutely terrible simplification. If you look at the geocritical tradition coming out of France, you have Westphal, for example, talking about an oscillation between the real world and the fictional world. And there was talk of this earlier today, how there's a certain kind of referentiality and that the places tug on one another. For me, the point is that they not only tug on each other, but they influence each other. And here Bakhtin steps in again because of his idea of the chronotope, where a novel is encoded with the geohistorical situation in which it was created, but at the same time, that geohistorical situation bears the trace of that novel. It goes both ways. As for the voyeurs and walkers, or voyeurs and walkers, the quals and quants, Mariana Pavlovskaya argues that GIS is never as quantitative as we actually think. And it actually has, I'm sure this is familiar to many, if not almost all of you, that there's an inherent qualitative sense of GIS that bubbles up through the foundation. That calling GIS quantitative is done after the fact. After all, my data set is a work of literature. It's hard to get a more qualitative data set than that. So, as this crowd well knows, there's no reason to stay bounded in that little box. GIS straddles being both a voyeur and a walker. Engaging with literary texts involves engaging with the world in which the text is, as well as the worlds within the text. And so the sheep can get out of the box and can say, make me a map. So that's what I did. So I stripped out everything that was larger than a city in the for whom the bell tolls, just because I wanted points. I didn't want to deal with polygons. And you see that the upper Montana area, Montana-Wyoming area gets a lot of representation in this novel, but the East Coast doesn't get any representation at all, which is very weird for an American novel of the 1930s, considering in 1930, I think 2/3 of the US population lived from the seaside to about here. And if you zoom into Spain, here the legend shows that purple is the plot header block site, yellow is the partisan dialogue, red is places Jordan thinks about in his monologues, and blue are other people's monologues. I think those little dots, they're like one hit apiece, so they're not super, super important. And if you zoom in on Madrid, you see that there's a lot of separation, that even specific places in Madrid get mentioned. It just gets more and more granular. And here, if this was the interactive version, you can see that This is Madrid itself, which Jordan mentions in his monologues, I think, 23 times. And this is a hotel, Gaylord's Hotel, which was where the communists had their base, I think. And Jordan mentions that place to himself, thinking about it 42 times, which is a lot. And then if we look at, the interesting thing is when we look at just Jordan's monologues by themselves, we can see that he's thinking about all of Spain, almost all of Spain. It's a lot of Spain. And even if we affix the front, so this is the October 1937 front, approximate, it shows that he's not just thinking about Republican Spain. Sorry, Republic is on the Barcelona side, and the nationalists, the winners' side is on this side. So he thinks a lot about Navarra, which is his favorite place in Spain, which is monarchist Carlist, completely not devoted to the Republican cause. He thinks about his time in the Basque Country, which I think had just recently fallen. And so the breadth and depth. So there's breadth in that he talks about all of Spain, and there's depth in that he talks about Madrid a lot. Bears out when I do a nearest neighbor calculation of the three sites. This shouldn't be too terribly surprising that Jordan's monologue has a z-score of negative 4.61, which means it's hilariously clustered. Really clustered. But the discursive sets are less clustered because there's more conversation. People are bringing different ideas into consideration. The sort of interpretive aspect of this is speculative. But the interesting thing about the last one, the narrative one, is that the computer, as far as the computer can tell, those points are distributed at random. They're neither clustered nor distributed. So somehow the plot, partisans marching through the woods and seeing planes flying from Madrid and Segovia, managed to create this kind of random sense. We can talk about that later, perhaps. So basically now it's time for the mixed methods approach that is promised by qualitative GIS. From a strictly geostatistical vantage point, we know that Jordan's monologues are terribly clustered while also having an average distance between them of 33.8 kilometers. So it's clustered yet spread out over all of Spain. From reading the text closely, we know that Jordan traveled extensively around Spain before the war and even wrote a guidebook about Spain that is compared favorably to Richard Ford's. Richard Ford was a Bible salesman, an evangelical, I think, Bible salesman who wrote a travel book about Spain. And Jordan takes this as high praise that his travel book is compared to Ford's, which was from the early 19th century. And then we get the sense that Jordan, or we know also from reading the text, that Jordan spends a lot of time thinking about both the US Civil War and alludes to the race wars against Native and African Americans that unified white America in the second half of the 19th century. This is a standard narrative of the holiday Memorial Day, for example, was an opportunity for the white soldiers who fought each other during the Civil War to come to terms and say, we're both veterans of a war, let's be friends, and let's hate Spain instead, which is what happened. Memorial Day was started in 1895, and then shortly thereafter the US went to war with Spain. But as Ford reminds us, and this is, whether or not this is actually true of Spain doesn't really matter because Ford's presence in For Whom the Bell Tolls already gives it some kind of currency, which is that Spain is basically a fiction. A unified Spain just doesn't exist. It's something that you put on a map, and it's something that's useful for politicians. Words I stumble upon when researching this, especially is patria chica, that you have your local, your attachment to your local area, and that's what's most important. But this idea of a national unified republic in Spain is completely crazy. Well, not completely crazy. So the mixed methods yield unexpected results, which is great for scholars, I think. The GIS poses an unexpected question, which is why are Jordan's interior monologues so spread out over Spain in comparison to the stories told by the partisans in the plot? will either just tell a story about something that happened in one village where they killed everyone in the village, or they just talk about living in some village. Whereas Jordan talks about, blah, 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 I did this, I did that. Then the GIS also forces a rereading to find an answer with the new information. So now that we know that Jordan is talking about Spain as a whole, so we start thinking about, we get an answer, something like Jordan is constantly thinking about a fictional unified Spain. So then that reopens the reading. We can start thinking, okay, why is Jordan thinking about this unified Spain? His republicanism is one good reason. His similarity to Maria, this idea of the women that he meets and sleeps with, they're physically very similar, and there's a fascinating incest line of logic here where they're going to create a super race of half Spanish, half American Republicans, and his obsession with discipline. And mostly what it does is it begs for a reiteration of the text, an iterative kind of reading, where you plot the GIS, you get an answer, then you return and you start tweaking the GIS. What do Jordan and Maria talk about, for example? What are their specific conversations like? What spaces are associated with republicanism? And things like that. So breaking up the box with this kind of mixed qualitative GIS is only part of the solution. So that top line where we have lawyers and walkers is only part of the solution, because for me it's also important to remember that that box has two dimensions, and then we have to talk about the literature in terms of what's inside and what's outside of it, and gauge that harmonization. I like that word from the previous presentation. The harmonization of the data between the spaces. And once we do that, we'll find that the answers, the paths, there are always many. There's always new questions to solve, and so on. So here's my bibliography. This is all online. And thank you. That's it.